Magnus Carlsen is at the board earlier than his opponent. It's the FIDE World Rapid Team Championship happening in Astana, Kazakhstan. Magnus is playing for the team WR and the games have begun. You can see Magnus is not so happy there that his opponent is not here. He doesn't want to start the clocks. The arbiter, however, is ensuring that all the clocks are started. Nepo there, smiling. They are taking on the team of MGD1. It's 6 boards against 6 boards. Magnus is like, let my opponent come. And meanwhile, Jan Gustafsson gives Magnus a bottle of water and the arbiter starts the clock. Arjun Erigaisi is nowhere to be seen. There he is, arriving a little late to the game. Maybe he was just preparing a bit for the game perhaps. But Arjun takes his chair. Magnus actually goes and gives the bottle of water back because it was this bottle with soda, I think, not the one without gas. But there's no bottle there, so Magnus has to live with it. Pawn to e4 is what Arjun has played. Magnus comes back and the game has begun. This is going to be very exciting. The world number 1 takes on India number 1. e5 played by Magnus. Arjun brings out his knight to f3. Knight comes out to c6. And we have the Rui Lopez on the board. Will Magnus play a6 here or will he go for the Berlin with knight f6? He goes for knight f6, the super solid Berlin. And Arjun says, I'm not going for any end games. Anti-Berlin on the board with d3. And Magnus plays d6. The main move is to get your bishop out. But d6 is what Magnus has played. Arjun quickly castles it out. And Magnus now thinking about his move. He goes bishop e7. So it's a very modest way of development for black. And Arjun decides to take advantage of this fact. He plays d4 and Magnus quickly castles it out. Now, remember, if you try to win the e5 pawn, your own e4 pawn is hanging. So Arjun pushes the pawn to d5. You can drop your knight back to b8, but Magnus asks a question to the bishop. Where are you heading to? And if you go bishop d3, maybe he wants to come and attack here. So bishop goes to e2. The knight goes back. Now the e4 pawn is hanging. So Arjun has the space while black has excellent pawn structure. Knight d7 is played here and pawn to c4. Magnus quickly places his knight to c5, attacking the pawn on e4. The knight comes in and saves the pawn. But now Magnus gets the bishop pair. Queen takes d3. Arjun says my bishop was anyway not so great. It was hemmed in by its own pawns. So I'm okay to give it up. But now look at what Magnus has on his hands. This pawn structure is very solid and it's pointing in this direction, which means you try for the f5 break, and that's why he's gone knight e8 with the idea of f5. Arjun says, I have to start playing on the queen side. He wants to use his pawns to create some kind of a breakthrough on the queen side. The game is heating up. Magnus comes back and now f5. Is it going to be that? Yes, he plays it. Pawn to f5 on the board. Now, if you take here, the bishop comes out and it will be very dangerous. So, a5 played by Arjun and Magnus takes the pawn. Knight takes bishop f5. Not an easy decision by Magnus to take that pawn, by the way. He could have pushed it forward as well. But now, this is the position we have. There's a pin here. But Arjun's going to put his knight back on d2, reinforce his knight, push his pawn to f3. Magnus comes and attacks the knight on e4. What is Arjun going to play here? He takes his time. One of the ideas is to take on f6. The other one is to put your knight on d2. He does it. Knight comes to d2. So all of white's pieces are nicely positioned. He can push his pawn to f3 and then later on start rolling his queenside pawns. Meanwhile, for Magnus, his problem is the bishop on e7. He goes queen e8. And wow, the queen is going to come on this long diagonal here. Knight takes f6. You have to take with the rook or else you would have lost the bishop. Knight comes to e4. Now attacking the rook with a check there. So the rook comes back. And now Arjun has a very solid knight on e4. He pushes his pawn to f3, reinforcing the center. Queen g6, putting pressure here. And maybe it's time for Arjun to just push his pawn to b4. That seems like the normal way to play here because his center is very stable. He goes b4. Nice move there. I always love these structures where a circle is created here. It gives white lot of chances. b5, c5, lot of possibilities here. How is Magnus going to create play now? Because his bishop is not playing. This knight is very strongly placed in the center with the pawn on f3. You have to do something. And he pushes his pawn to h5. He wants to go h4, h3 and soften up the king side. Arjun now can push his king to h1 so that after h4 he can push h3 and the pawn wouldn't be hanging. But he decides to play on the queen side. He plays b5. This is risky strategy now. Can Magnus push his pawn here? Yes, he does. Pawn to h4. h3 is the plan. Arjun now pushes b6. Wow. And now we can just take it. Yes, he takes it. Bishop takes. The bishop is not particularly very active here. But after rook c8, Magnus says, I've got the open file. I'm attacking the c4 pawn. And Arjun plays c5. He sacrifices a pawn here. First, Magnus says, mate in one threatened. You need to do something about it. So Arjun has to push his pawn forward. That goes without saying. He takes his time a bit. Maybe he's calculating if g4 is possible or not. That doesn't seem a very wise idea. He pushes his pawn to g3. And now, bishop takes e4. Can be taken. Yes, Magnus takes it. And the pawn on c5 is actually being lost. Now, Arjun is actually placing his trust on the passer on d5. So, after fe4, yes, he has lost a pawn. But this pawn is a dangerous one. And that's the reason why Arjun has given up the pawn. He first takes the rook on f8. King f8, this is a pawn sacrifice, but perhaps it's not so well calculated because now Magnus pushes his pawn. Passed pawns lust to expand here, and passed pawns must be pushed. White's king, if it could reach in time to the c2 square, it would have been perfect, but Arjun's king is a bit too slow. He's now calculating, and he plays his king to e2. Well, if he gets king d2, he should be doing pretty okay. But Magnus plays another beautiful move here, bishop c5. Because after takes, the a5 pawn will be weak. Also, the black king is moving in. Arjun plays rook b1. And look at Magnus there. He spotted a very strong move. c3 played. Now, the problem with this is that c2 is coming in. And then later on, I can take here and move my king in. Arjun comes up with king d3. And now Magnus takes on b6. You can't take with the rook because c2 here. So he takes with the pawn. And now Magnus can push it forward with c2. Yes, he pushes. Rook c1. Now the c2 pawn is doomed. But Magnus brings his king. And Arjun takes the pawn. Oh my god. We are going into a pawn endgame. King takes. Is this a draw? Is this a draw? Arjun is banking on the fact that he has a protected passer here. So Magnus can actually go and win this pawn. But what Arjun will do is he'll use his king and try to stop these two pawns. Meanwhile, he has a pawn on d5. This is all very complicated, but it seems like Arjun believes the position is drawn while Magnus feels it's winning. Who's right here? Well, the bar says that it's actually Magnus, but in the game, they do not see the bar. g5 has been played here. And now Magnus says to Arjun, where are you moving your king? King c3, king a4, few options there. But black can snatch this pawn. The question will remain that after king c5, you can push your pawns a bit forward. But will they become queens? First Magnus takes the pawn. Now Arjun moves his king up. Magnus pushes it back with a check. King goes to c4 and he brings his king back to c7. If Arjun moves forward here to b5, then pawn to b6. Yes, he plays his king to b5, pawn comes up to b6, and right now the white king is quite well placed on b5. But look at how Magnus first goes to d7, so that when the king comes to b5, he goes to d6 and now snatches the c5 square. This is called as wasting a move. Now a4 pushed, so the king tries to stop it, and b5. These two pawns are very good friends of each other. But now the important thing is going to happen next is the black king is going to come in, because the white king has to move away. Where is Arjun going to play his king? King a3, king c3. He brings his king back to a3, and now Magnus quickly placed king to c5. You can see the goat of endgame in action. He's not even thinking here. He knows it's winning. He pushes his pawn forward. Now Arjun choice between king a2 and king c2, but these pawns are just so rapidly advancing, and Arjun actually misevaluated the position, because yes, he still has his d5 pawn left, but the black pawn duo are just so strong. b3 check has been given. You go with your king up to c3. Yes, he plays his king to c3, and Magnus now plays king b5. Once again a waiting move. If here white could just pass, then maybe this position is drawn. But that's the problem in chess. It's called zugzwang. You have to move. Once you move, it's disadvantageous to you. And Arjun now reluctantly plays his king back, king to d2. It wouldn't have helped even if he went king b2, because now king b4 and these pawns would be very strong. So he goes king d2, Magnus pushes his pawn to a3, king c3, pawn moves to a2, king b2. Now finally the black king has to stop controlling this d pawn, and that's what Magnus does. He comes king c4, lets the pawn advance. King d3's idea is a1, king a1, king c2. So for example here, and this is absolutely winning. Arjun resigns, because even if he made a queen, there was check, and it's a checkmate here. And so that's the reason why Arjun resigns here. But look at him. He wants to learn from Magnus even after the game has ended. And Magnus tries to just discuss a bit about it. And we're going to leave you with a small clip here to show you how interested Arjun was to use this opportunity to discuss the game with Magnus. Just have a look at it and enjoy.